Hi, everyone, and welcome to Learning Progressions for the New Now. My name is Rebecca Blouwolff, and I am a longtime middle school French teacher in Wellesley, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. And I chose this topic today because even though I'm a very experienced teacher and I had spent more than 20 years teaching middle school French in the same school, when we moved to emergency remote learning, I felt like I was a brand new teacher all over again. And it was a very stressful process. I was very unsure of what I was doing. And like many of you, I had no training in distance learning. So it was really a huge learning curve for me. And there were many days where I just remembered what it had been like to be a first-year teacher who was overwhelmed and confused and failing left and right. And then also the joy of every time I would have a small success. And I think I realized after several weeks of operating in that mode that what really mattered at this time was to focus on the essentials, the basics of best world language teaching practices, and try to make sure I was just bringing those to my students in this new format. So I needed different ideas for implementing the same strong ideas that I had been using already in my classroom. So when I say we'll always have Paris, my idea here is that we'll always have the core practices for world language learning, and we really need to lean on those in times when the structures of our teaching may feel very uncertain or unfamiliar to us. So today, what I want us to dig into are the core practices that you see circled here. The target language comprehensibility is really woven throughout. So that's not going to be a separate thrust of the presentation, but it's part of it. What I am going to be digging into explicitly is how we guide learners through interpreting authentic resources. And when we talk about guiding them through, that's really the learning progression piece. How do we start with the resource, bring students into the process of understanding it, and then have them build on that resource to create something themselves? And then the next one, this idea of designing oral interpersonal communication tasks, again, trying to adapt that core practice, that key skill, to a remote environment where you may or may not have live synchronous time with your students. So that's the plan for this session. And what I really want to emphasize in this first part with the authentic resources is that we need to plan for input before output. So we want to have a logical learning progression where students are at the beginning probably quite quiet and really looking at the resource, interpreting the resource before we're asking them to produce, and certainly before we're asking them to produce in the language. So that's the idea of a logical progression. So when we look at the actual core practice about authentic resources, I've just put in bold here a couple of the keywords for us to keep in mind. We want an interactive reading, listening, comprehension tasks with authentic cultural texts, which is going to require that we provide some appropriate scaffolding to help our students out. At the same time, we're promoting interpretation. So those are all the pieces that we're aiming for in this work. I'm going to show you an example of a synchronous learning progression from my grade 6 French class. So the target for that course is Novice Mid, and our can-do was I can identify and categorize free time activities. Now, if you don't have synchronous time with your students, you could certainly adapt this to an asynchronous activity. I began by showing just a tidbit from an infographic, not the whole thing, because I thought that would be too much for my learners. And then I gave them a pre-reading activity. Now, what I've really liked doing during the synchronous sessions is to make the presentation more interactive by using Nearpod or Peardeck, which allows me to take Google Slides, put this add-on program with it, and then when the students are answering questions, I'm seeing their work in real time and I can respond to it. So if you look down here, the pre-reading activity was for students simply to highlight or underline any words or phrases that they could understand. And so you'll see in this text, whether or not you speak French, there are some very familiar cognates with English. And then there's some other words that would be more of a stretch where the students might be relying on the illustration or simply an educated guess. I do find it helpful to highlight the word highlight and underline the word underline, just to reinforce what am I supposed to be doing? What is the final product supposed to be looking at? And just notice here, the students aren't producing any language in this task, right? They're simply marking up the text. So I really like that as an initial activity for an interpretive. Next here, we have some ACTFL IPA-type questions. Here I'm getting at the idea of there being a main purpose to this text. And you'll see when I'm listing a few different kinds of technology, I'm just providing options that I'm familiar with. But of course, every district has its own favorites, its own requirements, its own restrictions. And so I've told you the ones that I'm familiar with. When you see one marked in bold, that just means that the example you're seeing was made using that tool. So this is an example from Nearpod, but it's certainly not the only tool that you could do to ask this kind of question. So here I'm just asking the students, what's the infographic about? And you're going to notice I'm making it a multiple choice question. So I'm really narrowing the range of possibilities for them to make it not an overwhelming task. And some of the answers are a little bit similar because I'm trying to push them and make sure that they're really digging into some of the details and focusing there. Next, I ask students to think about activities that I and others do and do not participate in. So that was our next can do for the unit. And what I like to do at this point, you saw that first questions were in English. Now we're ready to have some questions in the target language. So really reinforcing the words that they're seeing in the text. And also to have what we call text to self questions. So connecting what they're reading or listening to their own feelings, emotions, and preferences. There is some research that suggests that students retain words better when they add that affective quality to them. So here I just said, which of these activities do you prefer? And then what's cool about doing this in Nearpod is it does a poll in real time where you can see how everyone voted, and then you can have a little discussion with the class. Oh, a lot of you like to swim. Some of you like to run and do weightlifting. Okay. And so it just gives you another way to repeat the important information in the text again and again with the students in a way that reinforces it. Now, once we've been through this progression, the students have marked up the text. They've figured out the main idea with a lot of scaffolding. They've had a personal reaction to it. Now they're ready for just the tiniest bit of output. And so again, Novice Mid, this is going to be highly scaffolded production. The teacher is helping them out. I am helping them out. Here, I used Nearpod again, but if you're familiar with Padlet, it's a very similar platform option. I had the students work in breakout rooms to ask one question, which we practiced asking out loud before I let them go. So I knew everyone could say, "Quelle activité préfères-tu?" And they were to listen to their partner's answer, and then they were to write their partner's answer. So again, I do think if we're going to have kids interview each other, there needs to be some purpose. It needs to be leading somewhere. There needs to be a reason to listen. And here the reason to listen was you needed to post about your partner. What ended up being nice then was once we had this whole thing created, we could have a little class discussion. Oh, what is Elizabeth like? Oh, I noticed that Lila and JJ prefer the same thing. Let's talk about that. So it becomes, again, a platform for subsequent interpretive work. So it's a progression, but there's also a real spiral element to it. All right, so that was a 6th grade synchronous progression. Let's take a look at a 6th grade asynchronous learning progression. So what I was doing each week during our distance learning this spring was to put out one Google slideshow a week. The kids would get it on Monday, they'd work through it and hand it in on Friday. And so I tried to have that idea of a progression follow through the slides that they were completing that week. So again, they were still working with this can-do of identifying, categorizing free time activities. Here, again, we see a tidbit from an infographic. And again, I'm asking them, what's the main idea? This example was made with editable Google Slides, as I mentioned. And then what's a nice feature is you can make a copy for each student. So the kids are actually editing a slideshow and putting their answers into it rather than having to create a new document where they record all their answers. But there's certainly other forms that would work as well. Again, nonverbal processing, where I'm asking the students to show what they've understood without having to form answers in the target language. So for example, we had studied in this graphic wheel that there are different kinds of sports and activities that are popular. And then I just ask the students to illustrate each category with one example. So I can see by what they've posted that they understand which activities do and don't fall into those categories. And again, I think especially for asynchronous work, so important to provide a teacher example. So I showed hiking as an example of an individual sport, and then I'm hoping they can do the other three, getting the idea, oh, I'm supposed to find a picture, I'm supposed to paste it on the right color, etc. Now, once the kids have dealt with that input, we're doing a semi-output activity, but it's a little sneaky. It's actually more input. So take a look at this. I'm just giving them a list of statements in the target language about preferences, and they're highlighting the ones that are true for themselves. So they don't need to produce any original language, but they need to be careful readers in order to know which ones to mark. So that's why I'm saying it's a little sneaky, because it's getting the kids to read and see the vocabulary again. It's repetition that's not repetitious, as Laura Terrell would say. And I just did this again in Editable Google Slides, but there's lots of ways you could have kids highlighting things that are true for them. So that is the end of the Novice Mid grade 6 examples. For those of you who teach high school, for example, I think this next series will be a little more relevant. I wanted to show some examples from my 8th grade French class, which has an intermediate low target. And this spring we were working on a food and eating habits unit. And so we were at the point where we wanted to be comparing typically French eating habits to how our own families eat. So hopefully this will look familiar from the 6th grade example. I had a text, this time much longer text with less visuals, and I simply read the text aloud to the kids as they had it in front of them, and I asked them to mark it up with what they understood. And I do think this is an important distinction, to have the kids focus on what they do understand when they're looking at something new, rather than circle everything you don't understand. Because what ends up happening is when they get to the end of the article, they're gonna have a lot of stuff highlighted or underlined, and I think they're gonna feel pretty good, and they're also gonna realize they have a lot of information already without having looked up a single word. I did this in Nearpod. There's certainly other ways that you can have kids marking up texts in a way that you can see them. And if you were in an asynchronous situation, you might make a recording of yourself reading the article, have the kids listen to it on their own time and mark it up. So it doesn't need to be substantially different. Here I also ask the kids to start to connect text to self as you're reading, not only what you understand, but what are you reading about teenagers in France and their eating habits that's also true for your own eating habits. So really trying to get the kids to start to make a connection as they're interpreting the text. Now, another way to bring this text back is that I wrote a paraphrased version of it, so in very student-friendly language. And then here, I made a fill in the blanks with Nearpod. If you're familiar with the Textivate website, that is a paid site, but it also allows you to do that kind of work where you provide a fill in the blank or put the text in order. It's really just getting the kids to read over the important ideas another time. So more input, more repetition, but it feels fresh because the task is different. Another example here is this one's made with Textivate. It's the same article that the kids had read aloud to them earlier, but I'm asking them what's the next part of the text that would follow from these sentences. And so they just have to see, okay, which of the 1, 2, 3, or 4 would be the next logical sentence. So they're seeing all that language again and having to figure out what it means. Always focusing on meaning. Now, once the kids have really worked their way through this text, upways, downways, sideways, every which way, there's something for us to talk about. Very scaffolded. So students were to circle what was similar. I can now have a whole class discussion, or if I'm able to do breakout rooms, a breakout room conversation. Oh, which things did you circle? What was true for you in this text? And then the kids might notice that amongst themselves, they also have some similar points. One thing that I found helpful if I wanted the kids to have a text-based conversation is to make sure that they had the information they needed in front of them. So if they needed to screenshot something before they went into breakout rooms, for example, I would be sure to prompt them. And I would also provide some sentence starters for those conversations. So once you get into the breakout rooms, you can say things like, me too, or, oh, not me, or I didn't understand this, or I was surprised by. So really prompting the kids to have the language they need for the conversation. And if you're watching this and thinking, but I don't have breakout rooms, we have to use Google Meets, or I don't even have synchronous meetings with my students, there's different ways to work around that. If you don't have access to breakout rooms, you might think about having small groups that meet for shorter amounts of time rather than having the whole class together as a big group, providing office hour opportunities. I had a lot of success with just offering 15-minute groups for students in groups of 6 or fewer. And so 15 minutes for 6 kids, everyone gets a few turns to talk, which was helpful. And then I think another reality of distance learning is that we do have to accept that there's going to be some turn taking, possibly some volunteers who want to speak, possibly calling on non-volunteers, but that may just be one of the compromises we're going to have to make in this situation. Now, once the students are feeling pretty comfortable about what they've read, they're talking to each other a little bit about what they've noticed in the text, we could now move into a writing task. So here I had a little board where students could comment, what did you notice that was similar and different from how the French eat in your own eating habits? And I gave them several examples that we had discussed already in class. When do you eat? What do you eat? And then each student wrote a brief post. What I like about doing this during class time is that I could see right away common errors, which cultural facts the students had really absorbed and were hammering away at time and time again. Also errors in terms of understanding, oh, wait, you're saying that you're like the French because your family has dinner at 5 p.m. When do French people tend to have dinner? And coming back to anything that had been missed. So it does give us some pretty immediate feedback opportunities to just dive in and give a little information where we see students need it. All right, so that was a whole look at authentic texts and learning progressions that allow students to move from input to output. What I want to turn now to for the rest of the presentation is this whole challenge of interpersonal speaking in a remote environment. And the two pieces that I'm going to focus on in order to support students in doing this work are the ideas of providing scaffolds and what we call in my department level ups. So let's take a look at that first by just reminding ourselves what ACTFL tells us about this core practice. So when we're designing interpersonal communication tasks, I think the key words here in bold that the teacher is designing these tasks. So there's got to be some thought put into the beginning, the middle, and the end, the learning progression piece. And when I say task, I'm just trying to differentiate a purposeful use of language that serves a purpose from something that's more like an exercise where you're just manipulating parts of the language without a focus on meaning. Or you might even be exchanging information, but there's no greater purpose that's tied to that exchange. So if we can make it purposeful and leading somewhere, students will be more engaged, will see the purpose more, and hopefully will say more as well. So here's an example from my 6th graders again. So we're back to basics. And what I would do is provide just a very clear scaffold via a table. So I'd create a shared Google slide that every student could edit. And then I would give them a very specific task. So here we were working on which activities do you do in which seasons. And I created the table with the 4 seasons, and I wrote a couple of examples for myself. So Madame Blouwolff likes to do these things in winter, in spring, in summer, in fall. And then not only did I give them examples like that, in that blue box, on the right, I actually gave them a word bank with all the expressions we learned for different activities. And so the kids needed to go in, look through that blue box, and choose expressions that suited their activities in those seasons. So that was purposeful in terms of we're working with vocabulary that we're trying to get on top of. But in addition, the purpose of creating this document was that we could have a conversation about, oh, Who likes to swim in the spring? What kinds of things do people tend to do in the fall? Who's the only person who does gymnastics in the winter? And so it became a springboard for subsequent communication. This is at a very, very simple level, obviously, but I hope it's clear that when you get students to put some ideas down on paper or just in front of themselves and even in a digital way, that gives you something to work with in subsequent lessons that you can revisit. Here's another way that played out. So once they had completed that document, I was able to create a series of questions that sent them back to that table to find the answers. So here I basically was just using an online worksheet, but there's other ways that you could pose the questions. And then once the kids were able to answer my questions, then I had them start to write their own questions. They had teacher models and they could post questions on Padlet that their peers then had to go back into that document and find. And it was also a nice, we did a little community building because you get to know a little bit about your classmates and what they do at different times. All right, let's take a look at 8th grade now. So the intermediate low target. And again, for those of you who teach high school, this is hopefully more adaptable to what you would do. I'll just note that we were studying, so we were in the food unit, and I had this great authentic resource that illustrated and labeled each meal of the day from a French perspective. And so the kids, I broke them into breakout rooms, and each breakout room was assigned one meal. So they were looking at just that page of the authentic resource with their group members, and they needed to figure out a couple different things. What are people eating for this meal? What is similar between you and the French for this meal? How's your family similar? So there we had the opportunity to do the first person and the third person singular. This whole table was in French for my students. I'm giving you the example in English so you can follow along. But this really got them digging into an authentic resource. The task had that jigsaw aspect because each group was responsible for a different meal. And the task was quite specific. They had this editable Google slide where they were going to fill in the information as they worked, which also lent some accountability. So if I noticed that room 3 hadn't filled in anything for lunch, that's my prompt to go into breakout room 3 and see if they're okay, if they understand what they need to do, maybe try to move them forward a little bit if they're working slowly, etc. Here's another look. Once the students have come up with some identified language for talking about their eating habits, we can think about a listening activity that then would lead to some speaking. So again, if we're aiming for interpersonal speaking, we can't start there, but we can think about what would get us there. So here's an example from a synchronous lesson that I did where I wanted students to be reading different possibilities for how families eat and then responding with a nonverbal task. So if you look at question 1, it says, at my house in general, my mother prepares dinner, my father prepares dinner, I prepare dinner, we don't really make dinner. And I was just asking the students to respond with a letter from the ASL alphabet so that I could check all the faces on my screen and see what people were answering, which then let us have an interesting group conversation. Oh, wow, people still have a lot of the moms are still preparing dinner. What's going on here? Anyone here prepare dinner for their family? Oh, wow, tell us what your specialty is, etc. So the students are reading a lot of language. I'm sort of making a pseudo conversation with their answers in order to give them more examples and uses of those words in a meaningful context. Okay. Another fun way to do this with younger students, instead of having them answer with letters, would be to have little GIFs of exercises. And, instead of answering A, maybe you have to do this with your hands to show that your answer is A. And if your answer is B, maybe you need to go like this. Or maybe it's push-ups or jogging in place. So that is just another tip for trying to keep students really active. I learned about that from Samara Spielberg, and my 6th graders really enjoyed that kind of physical activity during remote learning. This is another example of what it looked like when the students were giving their answers. What I would also just say is after they were done giving their answers, I immediately asked them, I gave them a slideshow with the questions and the possible answers, and I said, I want you to just use this as a script to record how your family eats. So maybe they're going to say, at my house in general, we don't really prepare dinner. And then read through the other prompts, choosing one of the answers. So I'm not asking them to create with language yet. I'm asking them to select language that speaks to their personal situation. I had them record these videos on Flipgrid, but there's lots of other platforms that would let you do that. What was nice about doing it on Flipgrid is that the next assignment could be, I want you to listen to some of your classmates' recordings and respond by saying how you are similar and different to them. So the first interpretive activity brought us to this next speaking activity, which then lent itself to the beginnings of an interpersonal activity. And here is the prompt for that Flipgrid. So once they had made that first set of videos, then they had to listen to a classmate's video, comment on what was same and different. And you'll see here, I did again give sentence starters. For more advanced learners, that might not be necessary, but I really felt like while the kids were doing remote learning, I wanted them to get out as much as they could. And I wanted to make sure that they had something to rely on as a support, as a scaffold for the task. And I found that their recordings were longer because I had given them several different sentence prompts that sort of sent the message that they were supposed to say several different things in their response. Here's another example from once the students were pretty comfortable with this topic of eating habits, they had done cultural comparisons, they had listened and answered for one another, then I had them start to think about what are some questions you could ask your peers in order to learn about their eating habits. And so I just had them brainstorming questions. This was the very first beginning step of us working toward a talk conversation where students would be able to sit in small groups and have a conversation with every student participating about this topic. So this was the first step, which is brainstorming questions. Once we had those questions, then the kids could actually start practice using them. So the next day would be, okay, look at those questions that you all posted. You're going to get into breakout rooms of 3 and you're going to have roles. So person A asks the question. They're just reading it from that poster, the board we had made. Person B needs to answer it in a full sentence, trying to get a lot of language out of them. And then person C, can you come up with a follow-up question, which necessitates listening carefully to person B, which oftentimes young people and language learners, and frankly, all people don't listen to people's answers to their questions. So that C person is a plant to reinforce the listening. Once the kids have done a roll around like that in those roles, they can change. Okay, I was A, now you're A, you're B, I'm C, and do a new question. So just by doing that really artificial turn taking early on, that prepares them for a semi-authentic, free-flowing conversation in subsequent lessons. Oh, sorry, let me back up here and say a little bit more about that. So for that talk conversation, what it's going to look like is maybe 5 or 6 students gathered together, for example, on a Zoom. My goal, I said to them, was I'd like each of you to try to participate 5 times. And I actually had them hold their hand out and put a finger down after they participated each time so that they were accountable for participating. Also, so the group members could see who hasn't yet participated 5 times and try to bring them into the conversation. When I call it a talk conversation, I'm referring to a rubric by Shrum and Glisson in the teacher's handbook. T refers to target language use and talking in the language. So that's the top priority here. A is accuracy, not in the sense of did you make any mistakes, because of course you make mistakes, but rather could we understand you? And if we can understand your message, then you're being plenty accurate for us. L stands for listening. So that is that part about, are you able to ask a follow-up question showing that you were listening to the conversation? Also, are you able to ask a question that hasn't already been answered? So if Gina just told us that her family has dinner at 5 p.m., do not ask Gina what time she has dinner, because we are already supposed to have known that. So that's the listening piece. And then the K is for kindness. And I tell my students, I don't just mean that you're smiling and being nice to people as you're doing the talk, but you're keeping the conversation going without taking over. So you are being an active participation member of the group. And so I found, the talk conversations were a feature of our interpersonal work in school before we let out, and working toward them in the remote environment allowed us to build a bridge from our past experiences to our present, but also to make sure that students were practicing that most important skill. So I hope that gives you a sense of not only the earlier learning progression from interpretive to being able to speak or write, but also from interpretive to being able to have some sort of conversation. And those are learning progressions. So with that, if you have questions, I am not live at this exact moment, but this is where you can find me, and I would love to talk about these conversations with you more. Thanks so much.